Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Chang had been friendly until they showed up at my door together with a list of complaints that painted me as a nightmare neighbor. I was sitting in my tiny studio apartment on a Tuesday evening, still in my work clothes, eating leftover pizza straight from the box while catching up on some mindless TV show. The day had been exhausting, and all I wanted was to decompress in peace. That's when I heard the deliberate, authoritative knock on my door. Not the casual tap-tap of a friend or the hurried knock of a delivery person, but the kind of knock that makes your stomach drop because you know something serious is about to happen. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see Mr. Peterson, my usually laid-back landlord, standing next to Mrs. Chang, my next-door neighbor who I'd always had pleasant small talk with in the hallway. They both looked unusually formal and stern, which immediately put me on edge. Mr. Peterson was holding a clipboard with what appeared to be official documents, and Mrs. Chang had her arms crossed in a way that screamed disappointment. My heart started racing as I invited them in, my mind frantically trying to figure out what I could have possibly done wrong. I'd been living in this building for 8 months, and I genuinely thought I was a model tenant. I kept to myself, paid rent on time, and tried to be considerate of my neighbors. Sure, I occasionally played music or watched TV, but never at unreasonable hours, and I always kept the volume at what I thought was a respectful level. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and began reading from his clipboard. The list of complaints was extensive and shocking. According to their documentation, I had been playing loud music until 2 a.m. on multiple occasions, something I was absolutely certain I had never done. They claimed I had been slamming doors and stomping around my apartment at all hours, which confused me because I made a conscious effort to be quiet, especially late at night. They accused me of leaving trash in the hallway, which was completely false since I was actually kind of obsessive about keeping common areas clean. But the accusations got worse. They said I had been having loud, disruptive arguments on the phone that other tenants could hear through the walls. This one particularly stung because I rarely talked on the phone at home, and when I did, it was usually quiet conversations with my mom or sister. They claimed I had damaged the hallway walls by carelessly moving furniture, which was impossible since I had barely any furniture to begin with and had been extra careful when I moved in. The most hurtful accusation was that I had been deliberately antisocial and rude to other tenants. They said multiple people had complained about my attitude and that I made others feel uncomfortable in their own building. This hit me hard because I actually struggled with social anxiety and had been making a real effort to be friendly and approachable. Every time I saw neighbors in the elevator or hallway, I would smile and say hello even when it felt awkward or forced. Mrs. Chang then pulled out what appeared to be a petition signed by other tenants, all requesting that something be done about my behavior. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and confusion as I saw familiar names on the list. These were people I had been trying to build friendly relationships with, people I thought liked me well enough. Seeing their signatures felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than I expected. As they continued reading their complaints, I found myself getting increasingly defensive and emotional. I tried to explain that I didn't remember doing any of these things, that there must be some misunderstanding. But the more I protested, the more evidence they seemed to have. They mentioned specific dates and times when these incidents allegedly occurred, and some of them aligned with days when I remembered being home alone, quietly reading, or working on my laptop. The worst part was how matter-of-fact they were about it all. Mr. Peterson explained that while he didn't want to evict me, the complaints from other tenants were becoming impossible to ignore. He said that several people had threatened to move out if the situation with me wasn't resolved, and as a landlord, he had to prioritize the comfort and satisfaction of all his tenants, not just one problematic individual. Mrs. Chang added that she had tried to give me the benefit of the doubt because she genuinely liked me as a person, but that my behavior had become too disruptive to overlook. She mentioned that other neighbors had been complaining to her about me for months, asking her to speak to me directly, but she had been hoping the issues would resolve themselves naturally. I felt completely blindsided and hurt. The accusations felt so unfair and inaccurate that I started questioning my own memory and perception of events. Maybe I had been louder than I thought? Maybe my social anxiety came across as rudeness? Maybe I was so focused on trying to be a good neighbor that I had completely missed how my actions were affecting others? The emotional weight of being confronted with such overwhelming evidence of my apparent failures as a neighbor and tenant was crushing. I had moved to this building specifically because it seemed like a quiet, friendly community where I could feel comfortable and safe. The idea that I had been making other people uncomfortable in their own homes made me feel terrible about myself. Update 1. The conversation continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only about 30 minutes. Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Chang took turns presenting more details about my alleged bad behavior, and with each new piece of evidence, I felt smaller and more confused. They had documentation that seemed incredibly thorough and professional, complete with timestamps and witness statements. They showed me photos of what they claimed was damage I had caused to the building. There were scuff marks on walls that I didn't remember making, and they said these were from me carelessly moving my belongings around. They had reports of me supposedly leaving personal items in common areas, which was strange because I was usually paranoid about leaving anything outside my apartment, even temporarily. One of the most confusing accusations was that I had been cooking foods with strong smells that were bothering other tenants. This was particularly baffling because I barely cooked at all. Most of my meals were simple things like sandwiches, salads, or microwaved frozen dinners. The idea that my cooking was offensive enough to generate formal complaints seemed impossible. They also claimed that I had been inconsiderate about shared laundry facilities, hogging machines, and leaving wet clothes unattended. This accusation felt especially unfair because I actually went out of my way to be courteous in the laundry room. I always set timers so I could move my clothes promptly, and I cleaned the lint trap and wiped down surfaces after each use. As they continued their presentation, I noticed that both Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Chang seemed to be watching my reactions very carefully. At first, I thought they were just trying to gauge whether I was taking their concerns seriously, but there was something else in their expressions that I couldn't quite identify. It almost looked like they were trying not to smile, which seemed completely inappropriate given the serious nature of our conversation. The breaking point came when they told me that other tenants had been discussing me at building meetings that I apparently wasn't invited to. They said there had been multiple conversations about what to do about the problem tenant, and that some people had suggested going directly to management company instead of giving me a chance to improve my behavior. Learning that my neighbors had been talking about me behind my back, holding meetings about my behavior, and generally treating me like a problem to be solved was devastating. I had been living in this building for months, trying my best to be a good neighbor, and apparently the entire time people had been viewing me as a nuisance. I started crying, which made me feel even more embarrassed and pathetic. Here I was, a grown woman, crying in front of my landlord and neighbor because they were telling me I was a bad tenant. But the emotional overwhelm was too much to handle with composure. I felt like I was being attacked from all sides with accusations that didn't match my understanding of my own behavior. Through my tears, I tried to explain that I genuinely didn't remember doing most of the things they were accusing me of. I told them about my social anxiety and how hard I had been trying to be a considerate neighbor. I explained that I worked long hours and was usually exhausted when I got home, so I tried to keep quiet and stay out of everyone's way. But even as I was defending myself, I started wondering if maybe I had been unconsciously inconsiderate. Maybe my perception of my own noise level was completely off. Maybe my attempts at being friendly had come across as fake or annoying. Maybe I was one of those people who thought they were being considerate but were actually oblivious to their impact on others. The self-doubt was almost worse than the accusations themselves. I began mentally reviewing every interaction I'd had with neighbors, every time I'd played music or watched TV, every conversation I'd had on the phone. I tried to remember if there had been any signs that people were annoyed with me, any hints that I had missed. Mr. Peterson seemed to notice how upset I was getting, and his tone softened slightly. He assured me that they weren't trying to attack me personally, just address legitimate concerns that had been raised by multiple tenants. He said that everyone wanted to find a solution that would work for everyone, and that they were hoping I would be willing to work with them to improve the situation. Mrs. Chang nodded in agreement and mentioned that she had actually advocated for giving me a chance to address the issues before taking any formal action. She said that despite the complaints, she believed I was fundamentally a good person who probably just needed to be more aware of how my actions affected others. Their slightly more sympathetic approach made me feel a tiny bit better, but I was still reeling from the shock of learning that apparently everyone in the building had problems with me. I asked them what they wanted me to do to fix the situation, feeling desperate to prove that I could be a better neighbor. Update 2. Mr. Peterson pulled out another sheet of paper which he said was a proposed behavioral agreement that would allow me to stay in the building while addressing the concerns that had been raised. As he started reading through the terms, I realized how restrictive and humiliating they were. The agreement would require me to keep all music and television at barely audible levels even during normal daytime hours. I would have to limit phone conversations to specific times and keep them under 10 minutes. I would need to get approval before having any guests over, even for brief visits. The agreement also included a provision that I would need to attend monthly meetings with other tenants to discuss any ongoing issues and receive feedback on my behavior. I would be required to participate in building maintenance activities as a way to demonstrate my commitment to being a good community member. There were also financial penalties for any future complaints, with escalating fines that could eventually lead to eviction. Reading through these terms made me feel like I was being treated like a child who couldn't be trusted to behave appropriately. The idea of having to get permission for basic activities in my own home, the home I paid rent for, felt degrading and unfair. But at the same time, I was terrified of being evicted and having to find a new place to live, especially with this kind of negative reference from my current landlord. I was trying to process whether I could actually live under such restrictive conditions when something strange happened. I noticed that both Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Chang were struggling to maintain their serious expressions. Mrs. Chang had her hand over her mouth, and Mr. Peterson kept clearing his throat in a way that seemed like he was trying to suppress something. Then I caught Mrs. Chang's eye, and I saw it clearly. She was trying not to laugh. It was such an incongruous expression given the gravity of our conversation that it completely threw me off. I looked at Mr. Peterson and noticed that his shoulders were shaking slightly, as if he was holding back laughter too. My confusion must have been obvious because they both suddenly stopped trying to maintain their serious facades. Mrs. Chang was the first to break, letting out a small chuckle that she quickly tried to cover up. Mr. Peterson followed, and within seconds they were both laughing openly, though they were clearly trying to control themselves. I felt like I was losing my mind. Here I was, having an emotional breakdown about being the worst tenant in the building's history, and my landlord and neighbor were laughing at me. I didn't know whether to be angry, more upset, or completely confused. I just stared at them, probably looking as bewildered as I felt. Mr. Peterson was the first to compose himself enough to speak. He held up his hand in a gesture that seemed to ask for patience, then took a deep breath and said that they needed to tell me something important. Mrs. Chang was still chuckling but nodding in agreement, her earlier stern expression completely gone. That's when they delivered the most unexpected plot twist I could have imagined. Mr. Peterson explained that every single complaint on their list was completely fabricated. None of the other tenants had actually complained about me. The signatures on the petition were fake, the photos of damage were from other parts of the building or from years ago, and the behavioral agreement was something they had written specifically for this elaborate prank. I sat there in stunned silence as they explained that this entire confrontation had been their way of testing how I would handle conflict resolution. They said they had been observing my behavior as a tenant for months and had concluded that I was actually the most considerate, respectful, and responsible person in the building. Instead of being the worst tenant, I was apparently the best tenant they had ever had. The reason for this elaborate deception was that they wanted to offer me a position as the building's tenant representative. They explained that the building had been having real problems with tenant disputes and conflicts, and they needed someone who could mediate between residents and help resolve issues diplomatically. They had been looking for the right person for months and had decided that I had the perfect combination of patience, empathy, and level-headedness for the job. They wanted to see how I would react when faced with criticism and conflict, whether I would become defensive and angry or try to find constructive solutions. They said my response had exceeded their expectations and confirmed that I was exactly the kind of person they needed in a leadership role within the building community. The relief I felt was so intense that I started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than distress. The emotional whiplash of going from thinking I was a terrible neighbor to learning that I was actually appreciated was overwhelming. I felt like I had been on an emotional roller coaster that had finally come to a stop. Mrs. Chang apologized for putting me through such an intense experience, but explained that they needed to see how I handled pressure and criticism before offering me a role that would involve dealing with genuinely difficult situations between neighbors. She said that the building had been struggling with real tenant conflicts and they needed someone who could remain calm and fair even when people were upset or angry. Final update. As the shock of their revelation began to wear off, I started to understand the fuller picture of what they were proposing. The tenant representative position would involve mediating disputes between neighbors, organizing building meetings, and serving as a liaison between residents and management. It was a role that came with both responsibilities and benefits, including a modest reduction in my rent and a voice in building policies and improvements. They explained that the building had been dealing with several ongoing conflicts between tenants that had been escalating over the past year. There were disputes about noise, shared spaces, pet policies, and general building maintenance that had been creating a tense atmosphere for everyone. Previous attempts to address these issues through traditional management approaches had been unsuccessful, and they realized they needed someone who actually lived in the building and understood the daily dynamics between residents. Mr. Peterson showed me examples of real complaints and conflicts that had been submitted by various tenants, nothing involving me, but plenty of legitimate disputes that needed attention. There were neighbors who couldn't agree on appropriate noise levels, people who weren't cleaning up after themselves in common areas, and ongoing tension about guests and parking spaces. These were exactly the kinds of issues that their fake complaints about me had been based on, which made their test even more clever and relevant. The more they explained about the actual problems in the building, the more interested I became in the position. Despite the emotional trauma of their testing method, I could see that they had been thorough in evaluating whether I could handle the stress and complexity of mediating real conflicts. Their elaborate ruse had actually been a sophisticated assessment of my problem-solving skills, emotional regulation, and ability to stay focused on solutions rather than getting caught up in defensiveness. Mrs. Chang mentioned that she had been advocating for me specifically because she had observed how I interacted with other tenants over the months I had been living there. She said I was always polite and considerate, but more importantly, I seemed to have a natural ability to make people feel comfortable and heard. She had noticed that even the most socially awkward or difficult neighbors seemed to respond well to me, which was exactly the kind of interpersonal skill needed for the representative role. They gave me a week to think about whether I wanted to accept the position, understanding that their testing method had been intense and that I might need time to process everything that had happened. They also acknowledged that some people might be upset about being deceived, even for good reasons, and they wanted to make sure I was genuinely interested rather than just relieved to not be in trouble. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking constantly about their offer. The initial shock and emotional trauma of the fake confrontation gradually gave way to appreciation for how thoughtfully they had designed their test. They had managed to create a scenario that revealed exactly the qualities they were looking for, while also giving me insight into the kinds of challenges I would face in the role. I realized that their method, while unconventional, had actually been more effective than a traditional interview process could have been. They had seen how I responded to stress, criticism, and conflict in a realistic context. They had observed my natural problem-solving approach and my ability to stay focused on finding solutions even when feeling emotionally overwhelmed. By the end of the week, I had decided to accept the position. The experience had shown me that I was more resilient and capable than I had given myself credit for. If I could handle their elaborate test without losing my composure or becoming vindictive, I probably could handle the real challenges of mediating between actual conflicting neighbors. My first official act as tenant representative was to organize a building-wide meeting where Mr. Peterson and Mrs. Chang publicly apologized for their deceptive testing method and explained their reasoning. Some tenants thought it was hilarious, others were concerned about the ethics of such an elaborate deception, but everyone agreed that the building needed better conflict resolution systems. Over the following months, I discovered that I genuinely enjoyed the role and was apparently quite good at it. The skills I had developed through years of managing my own social anxiety had actually prepared me well for helping others navigate interpersonal difficulties. I found that my natural tendency to see multiple perspectives and look for compromise solutions was exactly what was needed to help neighbors work through their differences. The fake crisis that had initially seemed like such a devastating personal attack had actually been the beginning of finding a role where I could make a real difference in my community. Sometimes the most unexpected challenges lead to the most rewarding opportunities, even when they start with your landlord and neighbor conspiring to convince you that you're the worst tenant in building history.